Today we're talking about manufacturing domestically versus offshore. All right, we are on both platforms. Welcome. Today we are talking about manufacturing domestically versus offshore. I am Anna Livermore, founder of V.Mora, where we help your fashion dreams come to life. My company has helped hundreds of designers with patterns and samples and sourcing and manufacturing and all the things that you need in order to launch successfully. So if you're interested in starting a line, now is the best time to do that. You can contact me through my website, book a free strategy session, and we can go from there. So today we are talking about domestic manufacturing versus offshore manufacturing, and what the difference is, and what might be best for you. I watched Seinfeld last night, and it was that white puffy shirt episode, and now I just can't get it out of my head that that's the shirt I have on. I think it's this pretty close, but this one's Ula Johnson, so it's got to be cool, right? Anyways, I have a puffy shirt on. So manufacturing. Let's talk about offshore manufacturing, the pluses of working with a manufacturer offshore. First of all, the prices are going to be a lot less than if you're working domestically. And the reason being is labor laws. Everything that you make is sewn by hands. There is not a magic machine that sews anything. Even in there's some 3D knitwear machines that do a lot of the work. But even at the end of, there's still some trimmings or buttons have to be sewn on. So it's very rare that a garment isn't touched by human hands start to finish. So when you think about labor laws domestically, especially in New York versus the labor laws in anywhere in Asia, India, Mexico, the hourly rate is a lot less. Therefore, they can afford to charge you less. So when you're thinking about it in terms of I want to make this t-shirt for $3, the t-shirt probably takes at best 30 minutes to cut it and to sew it and to finish it. And if you're saying you want to pay $3, you're paying whoever that is, the cut and sew person on the floor, $6 an hour. And yeah, I guess in some countries that's considered to be a fair price, but you also think about the manufacturers have to make their price. So if you're paying the $6, that entire fee isn't going to the sewer. So think about it in terms of labor laws and people. When you're trying to get your prices down, you're directly affecting the sewers, the cutters, the people that are creating that garment. So yes, it is less expensive to do production offshore. It is more challenging to manage that production for the most part. If you are working with a factory that you can go, you can see the floor, you can talk to the sewers, you can go and see your production being made, it has a lot of advantages to working offshore. There's often a language barrier when you're working offshore, and it can be more challenging to communicate your needs of what this production should look like versus if you're doing something domestically. So the management of the production can be a little bit more challenging. We work with great factories here in the States as well as offshore. So the factories that we're working with are vetted. We've worked with them for many, many years. When you yourself are working with a new factory, it can be more challenging because you do have to vet that factory and find out if they can really do what they say they can do. And the only way to really find out is to work with them. So it is a higher risk when you're working with a factory offshore because they can they can kind of just disappear. Like you can pay them for your production or your samples, and then you can never hear from them again. Whereas it's harder for that to happen domestically because you can find the factory, you can report them to the BBB. There's things that you can do to get your money back. Whereas if you're working offshore, there's really like not a lot that's protecting you. So everything I'm saying is making offshore sound not so great. We will get to the benefits of working offshore, I promise. Quality control. So when you're working offshore, quality control is if you're working with a new factory and it hasn't come on a referral and it's really like the first production you've done with them, you'll want to hire a third-party quality control team to go in and check your garments before they leave the floor. Because once the garments in the manufacturing leaves the floor of the factory, they tend to not want to take responsibility for damages to the garments. They might say that, oh, the boxes got wet during the shipping or something happened during the delivery. They were fine when they left the floor. So if you're working with a new factory, it is offshore. There are companies that are just dedicated to being quality control for a third-party quality control. So they'll go in to that factory and count the garments, make sure that all the garments are there. They'll do quality checks depending on, like they might do every 10, they might do every 50. If you want them to check every single garment, then it's going to be more expensive, and that's not always necessary. Like you could say, check every 10 garments, and if something goes wrong, then go back and check every other, something like that. So having quality control offshore can be a challenge because you can't go there yourself. But that's the same thing. Like, let's say that you're working with a factory in New York and you live in Texas, you might not be able to go to the floor before the shipment goes out, but you'll want somebody there. That's what V.Mora does. We're production managers. So we will check your production, count it, do the quality assurance before it leaves. But it's really, really important to have a quality check done before the garments leave the manufacturing floor, because then you're more likely to get the factory to fix it and you're saving on shipping. Like if you ship everything, from China to New York and then you find something wrong there, then what? You ship it back, and shipping is so expensive and it takes a long time. So working with a company to do quality control prior to leaving, whether it's domestic or offshore, you have to do either way. It can be easier to scale production when you're working with a factory offshore. They usually have the capabilities to be doing larger production runs. When you're working domestically, if you grow from, say, doing 50 units to 1,000 units, more than likely you're going to have to change factories. The minimums when you're working with offshore factories tend to be higher because when you're thinking about shipping and FOB, which means freight on board, they include the shipping costs. If you look at all of that in order for it, and a lot of times they're shipping by container. So if you're only making 30 garments and they can't fill a container, then they have to find other brands or other items or other things to fill that container to make it make sense for shipping. So knowing that when you're trying to decide, like, am I going to do offshore or if I'm going to be doing domestic, minimums are a big part. Like we can do smaller minimums with our factories because we've worked with them for a long time. They know us, and like we're representing not just one client, but 10, 15 clients. So if you add all the production that V.Mora is doing together, we're getting closer to those minimums as a whole. But if you're a new designer and you want to do a small production, it's probably best to do that domestically. You can manage it better. You can keep an eye on it. And the factories are more set up to be doing smaller minimums here. I'm using a presentation, so that's why I keep looking down. The other advantage and thing that you want to think about is the carbon footprint. So the carbon footprint is how much energy does this garment take before it's in the consumer's hands? And if that garment is being made in China or India and it's being shipped by boat or even, by air is even more of a carbon footprint. But that garment takes more energy before it gets the consumer. If you can get a factory that's domestic, you can find fabric that possibly, a lot of fabric, unfortunately, is still made offshore. So you are shipping that fabric offshore to the States, to the factory. If you can find a mill that's domestic, there are mills that are domestic, but we're limited in the fabrics. Like, that's just how it is. I know that they're working on it to bring mills back to the United States. But if you're shipping from offshore with the fabrics and then you have the factory close to you, then you're saving on shipping from the factory to you. Or if you can find a fulfillment center that is close, if you're working in New York or California, finding a fulfillment center that's close will save on the shipping, which then lowers that carbon footprint on each garment. So the advantage of working domestic would be the carbon footprint of the shipping. The quality control we talked about, the lower labor costs, higher shipping expenses, and then you also have to deal with the import-export tariffs, which have, even on the fabrics that are coming in, the import-export tariffs and the taxes are increasing a lot. So the price per yard of fabric is higher than it used to be because of the taxes that we have to pay. There are some companies that are shipping fabrics to Canada, and you can have a manufacturer sew the garments in Canada, and then getting the garments from Canada to the States will save a lot. I think you bypass that 30% tax. So there are companies that are looking into that. I think even if you ship from China to Canada and then bring the fabrics from Canada here, that saves on cost. But you have those extra tariffs, and it can be quite complicated in customs to get garments in from offshore. So you'll want to talk to your factory. The factories that we work with, and if you're working with V.Mora, we handle all of that. The paperwork is taken care of. Like, we just get it shipped in. But if you're a new designer and you are your own production manager and the factory doesn't provide that service, then you'll have to do your research and prepare to deal with customs when those items make it to the States. So that can be an added cost and an added headache for the importing of the goods. All right. The other thing that is interesting when it comes to working offshore versus domestically is the idea of intellectual property. So when we're working, even with our factories that like we've worked with for many, many years and like we trust and we love and like they're great, they still won't really give us the patterns. They won't give us the patterns and where they're sourcing the materials. They're not going to give us that information because then they know we can take the product and go somewhere else. So even when we're working with companies that are going to do manufacturing offshore, we will sometimes still develop that product domestically. So we'll do the patterns, the samples, the tech packs. We'll create like this little package. We'll have the patterns digitized and graded and have that digital file. And then we've got the digital file, we have the perfect samples, we have the fabric sourced, and then we have this package, and then you can send that anywhere. You can send it to China, to India, to Mexico, California, Miami, New York, because you've got all the information that you need in order to be able to duplicate that for production. But if we start with a factory in China or India, and then we say, hey, like, this really isn't working out, I want to do this domestically. Sometimes they'll send us like a whole big box of like paper patterns that are unlabeled, that like we have to start over anyways. So that's something to keep in mind if you are doing offshore, is being able to pull everything that you need to know so that you can start somewhere else and not have to start from scratch is not a reality. So developing domestically and then producing offshore can be a good idea, because then you have everything is owned and sealed, and like you have access to everything. So being able to do that is beneficial, because then, like I said, you can bring it anywhere you want because you have everything. And it's not to say that the factories offshore are planning on using your patterns or stealing your ideas. It's just, how they operate. That's just how they operate. They don't want you taking your production somewhere else. So if you do choose to work with a different factory, normally you have to start from scratch. Now, the benefits of working offshore, I know I do work, we do have designers that work offshore, even though everything that I've said is like really saying why domestic is so great. But the costs are about a third of the price. Again, like the minimum wage in New York, I think, I'm not sure, $18. Minimum wage in China is, at least a third of that. So the workers are getting paid less, therefore the cost of your garment is less. You are able to compete with the bigger brands if you're doing offshore, because so many of those bigger brands are also producing offshore. So the cost is the biggest benefit. There also is more equipment, more machinery. They have been doing production for decades, and they have the money to be buying this equipment and machinery. Whereas in the States, everything kind of got pulled in the 80s and 90s. And then now the production and things are coming back domestically, but we haven't quite caught up. Not all manufacturers have the right machines for the different type of products. So you'll have to be a little bit more diligent in knowing what type of machines you need to make sure that the factory you choose has that equipment. When you work offshore, you don't have to source your materials. So they will source the materials for you and provide swatches, and you tell them like, hey, I'm looking for this fabric. You give them a swatch, and then they send you a bunch of fabric back, and they're able to source everything for you. When you're working domestic, you have to piecemeal a lot. You have to piecemeal basically everything. Like the person that does the fabric is different than the buttons, is different than the interfacing, is different than the linings, is different than the labels, than the logos. So you're having to piecemeal everything and coordinate that delivery to the manufacturer, and then time it so that they have everything they need prior to starting. Follow the tracking, make sure they know it's there, it's for you. So you've got to be a lot more hands-on with sourcing the materials. That's up to you. You'll have to find those vendors. And even your pattern maker, your sample maker normally is different than your manufacturer. So you have your patterns done, you'll make your samples, you'll do your fittings, and then that digitizer and grader that makes the patterns, into that digital file, whether it's OptiText or the Gerber system, that's a different person than even the pattern maker. Our pattern makers Julie is our pattern maker in LA, and she works on the Gerber system. So everything is digital, but in New York, our pattern maker does paper patterns. Then we take those paper patterns to our digitizer, and then the digitizer digitizes them and grades them and makes the markers. So that's another person. And then the factory domestically, a lot, I'd say most of them don't have the printers to print those markers. It's like the markers are as large and as wide as the fabric. So if your fabric's 58 inches, your marker is going to be 58 inches. So they don't have a printer that can do that. So you may have to print your marker and then deliver your marker to the factory. Once the factory has everything, then they will start your production. But normally, and some factories don't even cut. So then you have to have your garments cut in one place and then sewn in another place. And there could be send outs. Like this here is like I don't know if this is biased, but it's just like a self fabric tie. This would be a send out at a lot of factories which means like somebody else makes all of these ties and then that gets delivered to the factory. Spaghetti straps, embroidery, heat transfers, any printing, all of this normally is not done at a factory domestically and has to be done somewhere else. So that is one major advantage to doing offshore, is they will handle all of this, whether it's done in one facility or they're managing it between multiple facilities. But to you, like client facing, it's all in the same place. Whereas domestically, it's a lot more pieces revolving. So it's easier to do offshore because they'll source and they'll do everything for you. And the cost is less. So those are two really huge advantages to working offshore, which is why a lot of people choose to work offshore versus domestically. All right, I'm going back to our presentation here. I think I've got everything. Oh, so now I'm going to go over some red flags and then some green flags about working with a factory. This could be domestic, this could be offshore. Number one is eagerness to not work with a tech pack. And this is really, really common. If I had the top 10 mistakes that new designers make, I think it was like 2 weeks ago. Anyways, that is definitely worth watching. It's on our YouTube channel. It's on the Instagram. It's in the Facebook. It's everywhere. But one of them is not working with a tech pack. It's really, really common that the factory will say, don't worry about a tech pack. It's great. We don't need it. We don't work from tech packs. And you think, great. Now I don't have to, because that's another person, another payment. Now I don't have to pay for someone to make a tech pack. Awesome. Not awesome. This works as your contract per se of what the production is supposed to look like. So let's say that I wanted this to be white. The tech pack would say that this is to be white. And if I didn't have a tech pack, I have nothing in writing that says this is supposed to be white. And when it came back and it wasn't, I had nothing to go back to be like, hey, you actually made a mistake. And like, I clarified it here and you didn't follow my directions. So a tech pack provides the information for them and kind of holds them more accountable to what your production should look like. So always have a tech pack. When we are working domestically, our tech packs are different than when we're working offshore because we are present, we are there, there's less communication barriers. We're on the floor when they're doing the production. So we have different tech packs for domestically versus offshore. When we're working offshore, there's the spec measurements, There's the tolerances. So like this ruffle is, I don't know, 1.5 inches. And like it gives a tolerance of like if this ruffle comes back and it's more than a 1/2 inch off, you have to do the whole thing over. So the spec measurements has tolerances, measurements, all the different sizes. It's very detailed when we're working with offshore. So make sure that even if, and it's not like, oh, don't work with that factory because they tell you that you don't need a tech pack. Just say, oh, no, we'll have tech packs. It's best for everyone. We've already got those made. So make sure that you are providing tech packs. Lack of expertise in your product area. So I do manufacturing tours, and on the tour, the designers will ask the factories and they'll be like, do you do leather? Yeah. Do you do jeans? Do you do denim? Yes. Do you do baby clothes? Yes. 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 And like I'll watch my factories like say yes to everything, knowing very well, like they don't have a leather machine. They don't have the die cut to cut the leather. Like, they'll take the project, and then they'll outsource it. So it's up to you to know, like I said, what type of equipment your factory needs to have. So you can ask, well, where's your leather cutting, your die cutting machine? And where is, if it's a certain serger or if it's a V.Mora, like all of these things, you can ask to see that equipment. And then you'll be able to tell if they actually, and do they have an operator on that machine? Do they have an operator on that machine? Is it working? Is it covered and like it hasn't been used in like 30 years? So one way to know if they have expertise in your type of product is to know what machines and equipment you need to be able to do what you're asking them to do, as well as go and see what type of products are on the floor when you're there. And obviously I'm talking about domestically. When you're there, what are their sewers always sewing? What do you see hanging up? Is it knits? Is it woven? Is it underwear? Is it swimwear? Like you'll want to pay attention to, if you're there and you're doing denim and like they don't have any jeans and like all they're working on is like swimwear, it's not the right factory for you. So being able to visit the factory is also, if they won't let you visit, that's a red flag. So anyone, any factory should be open. Maybe you have to make an appointment and that's fine, but they should allow you to come and visit, see the facility, and you'll also want to be there when your production's being made. I say you don't want to drop your kids off at kindergarten and pick them up at high school graduation and expect that they grew up the way that you would want them to. So it's the same with your production. You'll want to know when it's on the line. Now, if the factory has said it's going to take 6 weeks for us to do your manufacturing or your production, that doesn't mean that your production is on the line for that 6 weeks. Your production may only be on the line for 7 days, but they have to fit you in on their timeline and like get their sewers ready and change the machine threads and all of that. So you'll want to know when your production is set to be on the line so that that's when you can visit. Know your factory's favorite booze, dessert, bring gifts, Jack Daniels, cupcakes, cookies for the sewers, whatever it is. Gifts really go far. So bringing some sort of sweet or treat for them to show them that you appreciate them and that they'll be happier to see you. So a red flag would be not allowing you on the floor, demanding your IP. So you want to make sure, I don't see this happen, but I've heard that it happens. You'll want to make sure that you own the designs, you own the product, that you own the intellectual property. If there are a lot of hidden fees, now hidden fees are tough because as a new designer, all the fees might seem hidden, right? Like you're paying for a marker twice and you're like, but I already paid for a marker, and you think it's a hidden fee, but it actually isn't, because every time you use a marker, you cut into that piece of paper and you need another marker if you're going to do another production. So it's kind of like you have to be educated around what fees to expect and what are normal. But if they do tend, just have an open communication. Communication is key with your factories. That is like the biggest red flag, is you have a hard time communicating with them, or when you're trying to contact them about samples, anything, it's not going well. Like, that is a huge red flag. It will not get better as your production goes on. So communication is key. The other is being too large or too small for your production. If your production is too large for them, then they could have bitten off more than they can chew. It could take longer for your production to be finished than they say. And if it's too small, they may not be interested in the product. They may push it aside. So you want to make sure you're right in that sweet spot for the manufacturing. Green flags would be excellent communication. Your manufacturers can make or break you. They are the most important relationship that you're going to make as a new designer. It's like picking out a husband or a wife. Like, they're going to be your life business partner, hopefully. So knowing that the communication as well, that you like working with them, all of that is really, really important. You're welcome to visit the factory. That's a green flag. They have a good reputation. If you can find a factory off of a referral, that's like the best way. But a lot of people have taken, decades to find the right factory. So they might not be as open to sharing where their manufacturing is being done. So it can be hard to get referrals. But at V.Mora, we give referrals. That's what we do. We place you with a factory that is perfect for you, what you need done, and your minimums. So you don't have to worry about that with us. Green flag, they want to see a physical sample and review a tech pack, the ability to keep up with your production demand, and they have certifications. So certifications for domestic, they should be on the wall. You can see them. You can ask to see them. When you're working offshore, there's things like GOTS and WARP. There's different certifications, but the thing with the offshore certifications is they tend to be expensive. So even if a factory is doing everything on par with what they're supposed to be, they might not always have that certification because, like I said, it's an additional expense to them. But it is helpful for the designer to know, like, this is a WARP certified manufacturer, because then you don't have to worry about them breaking labor laws or doing any of that horrible stuff. So having certifications is important. Okay, so this is the final. This is for domestic, and this could probably be its own talk. That's actually a good idea. I'm going to do a live on what is your responsibility to bring to a manufacturer versus what you think the manufacturer should do. So I'm going to list them off briefly here, but we'll do another live on how to prepare for production. So you should know your production quantity, your size range. You should have your tech pack. You should have a production ready sample. You should have a target retail price in mind. You should have your markers, your fabric, your trims, your labels, and your packaging, and know where this is going to be delivered, if there's any delivery instructions. So this is when you're working domestically, have all of those things prepared. When you're working offshore, I would still prepare all of this. Minus, you don't have to have like your fabric vendors, just what types of fabrics you want, your labels and your logos, all of that should be taken care of so that they can print those. But you want to be prepared. Like, all of this is your responsibility. You don't want your factory, even your grader, determining your size range or your spec measurements. You want to have a tech pack. So all of this is the designer's responsibility. Like, when I have a designer come and they're like, oh, my factory, they totally messed everything up and like, it's horrible. My question will be, well, did you provide a tech pack and a perfect sample? And if the answer is no, then it's like, well, they might have not given you a production. You didn't do everything on your side of the street to ensure that perfect production. So those are the things you want to make sure that you have. But I can do a whole conversation on that. So that is all I have. If anyone has any questions, I can take questions. Going once. Let's see. Just type your questions in the box. No questions. You can always book a time with me on my website at V.Mora.com. Book a 20-minute complimentary strategy session and we can go over questions. But I hope that this was helpful. That it can be intimidating. You know, am I going to do offshore? Am I going to do domestic? Which one's better for me? So I hope this was helpful and you got a lot of information out of it. And best of luck. Keep watching. Like I said, I'm going to do the prepping for production. We do this every Wednesday at 12:30, like across all the platforms. We're on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. All right. Well, thank you so much and have a great week. All right.